Doc Nancy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Today is a very special day for us because we are now holding the second of a three-part series on climate change. This one in particular is about innovation, industry, and the energy sector, advancing climate responsive industries. We are privileged to have with us four speakers that are prominent in the areas of climate change and industry, academia, integration. So it will not be hopefully a wasteful morning for you, but a very amazing morning of learning and figuring out how we can help in developing the recognition of mitigation in the climate change discussion, particularly as it relates to the area of energy and industry. So we will start with four different speakers, each of which will be giving their talks one after the other. I will be reading their bios. After that, maybe one or two questions, and then we will move on to the next speaker and the next speaker and the next speaker. So I look forward to a productive morning of discussion, and let's start with our first speaker. So Dr. Raymond Tan is a distinguished professor of chemical engineering and a university fellow at Salle University. He is a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences and an academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology. He has over 600 publications and 3,000 citations in Scopus database with an H index of 60. Based on Google Scholar citations, Dr. Tan ranks among the top researchers in the world in the subject areas of process integration, process systems engineering, and carbon management. He is editor-in-chief of Process Integration and Optimization for Sustainability, subject editor of Sustainable Production and Consumption. He also serves as on the editorial board of Clean Technology and Environmental Policy and the Cleaner Engineering and Technology. He's the author of books, Process Integration, Approaches to Planning, Carbon Management, Networks, and Input-Output Models for Sustainable Industrial Systems, and editor of books, Recent Advances in Sustainable Process, Design and Optimization and Process Design Strategies for Biomass Conversion Systems. He has received multiple scientific awards from government and professional organizations in the Philippines and is included in Reuters Hot List World's Top 1,000 Climate Research. So let us now hear from Dr. Tan on what he has to say about this matter.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope to spend the next 90 minutes in an earnest discussion on climate change mitigation. First, let me share my screen. Okay, it's coming up now. Is that visible now?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Okay, for the next, say, 10 or 12 minutes, I'm going to make the argument that climate change mitigation matters for the future of the Philippines. And this statement really is in response to what I've observed to be a rather disproportionate emphasis on climate change adaptation in Philippine policy, public discourse, and education when it comes to climate change. Now, just by way of brief self-introduction, I've been working on climate change-related issues since the late 1990s, before we even called it climate change. Back then, we used the term global warming. I started out working on projecting or forecasting the environmental impacts of next generation motor vehicle technologies for my PhD work. And then I have since progressed towards developing models and algorithms to help plan industrial decarbonization, having literally written books and, of course, a significant number of papers on that subject. The first thing that we need to do, I think, is understand the carbon cycle, which really is at the root of climate change. Carbon exists on Earth in three major compartments. There is atmospheric carbon, which is mostly CO2. And then we have terrestrial carbon, which is largely, a lot of it is biomass, which is either living biomass that includes plants and animals. It could be dead biomass, for example, carbon in soil, and long dead biomass, which is, for example, fossil fuels that we find underground that used to be organic matter. Then we also have carbon in the oceans, which is present in biomass form and also as dissolved ionic form in the oceans. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, on land, we also have geologic carbon, for example, carbon stored in carbonates. The problem of climate change is simply that we've superimposed on pre-existing natural exchanges among these three compartments from human activities has resulted in a net transfer of carbon from the land compartments into the atmosphere. That is driven primarily by the combustion of fossil fuels. That means that carbon that was originally underground in coal, oil, or natural gas is then being transferred rapidly to the atmosphere through combustion. And then there is what is known as land use change, or LUC. That is simply the destruction of pristine ecosystems, so that the carbon in live or dead biomass in these ecosystems gets transferred into the atmosphere, either as CO2 or even worse, as methane. So this is what's driving climate change. And because there's a net flow of carbon into the atmosphere, that is going to result in an accumulation of CO2. Currently, that now exceeds 400 parts per million and appears to be very difficult to stop. What we're going to need to do is not just at the planetary scale, or not just going to have to rebalance the flows. We're actually going to need to get to the point beyond the middle of the century towards trying to remove some of that carbon from the atmosphere. So that is at the global level, and obviously that needs to translate into the contributions of individual countries on Earth. Here's a quick statistic that we need to consider, just so we understand the scale of the problem. Current greenhouse gas emissions amount to about 40 billion tons per year. That's 10⁻⁹ billion, not million. And this has been growing at an upward trend basically since the dawn of civilization, with fluctuations here and there, and it's accelerated over the past few centuries since the Industrial Revolution. So we're now at 40 gigatons per year and growing, according to the IPCC, and in fact, the general scientific community. This figure needs to be brought down to a level of 0 gigatons per year by around the middle of this century. This is what the term net zero means. It actually means that the net annual flow of carbon into the atmosphere should be reduced from 40 billion tons annually to 0 in about the span of one human generation. That means that over 25 years, the amount of technological and policy and lifestyle changes that will be needed to effect this change would actually be very daunting. But at the same time, it's a hard problem to solve. And step one is to actually recognize that that is a challenge that we need to try to contribute to. The good news is that roughly about 3/4 of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, when we account for them at the country level, 75% are already covered by what are known as net zero commitments or pledges. That means that majority of the countries on Earth have actually made some kind of pledge to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. Some by 2050, for example, the European Union has a target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Even other developing countries that are major greenhouse gas emitters also have made pledges. In the case of China, the target date is 2060. In the case of India, the target date is 2070. There is still a small minority of holdouts that have not yet gathered up the political will to make a net zero pledge, and the Philippines is one of those countries. There are implications for business that we need to understand. For example, I think it's safe to assume that many people in the audience have Apple products, whether it's a Mac or an iPhone. That company, for example, has a net zero pledge, and their target date is 2030. So this is actually something that's happening in the real business environment, especially for the world's leading companies. So there are net zero commitments that are being done at the corporate level. At the same time, there are companies that are being started focusing primarily on providing decarbonization services for the Apples and Microsofts of the world. So, for instance, a company known as Climeworks has a couple of demonstration plants, and they're selling carbon credits to companies that need to decarbonize. So this is an actual growing business. Now let's have a look at the Philippine picture. The greenhouse gas emissions of the Philippines, when we account for them from the production standpoint, and if we consider not just CO2, but we consider methane, for example, from rice farming, and nitrous oxide as well, is roughly about 250 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The carbon footprint of the Philippines, that means when we consider also the carbon emissions embodied by our imports, is much larger than this. It's about 320 million tons per year and growing steadily. So it's not quite true that the Philippines has a minute contribution. It's a growing contribution, and we actually about 1/4 of our carbon footprint occurs in other countries. In other words, those countries generate emissions to meet the needs of the Philippines. In terms of public sentiments, just like many developing countries, it's still not well understood among the general population that the eventual elimination of fossil fuel technologies is going to be essential as the ultimate climate solution. Less than half of Filipinos surveyed in this report understood that implication, as compared to, say, typically 3/4 of the population in developed countries. So this is why we're doing this in PAASE, trying to build awareness of these challenges. There is, of course, there are efforts being made to clean up the Philippine ecosystem, one of which is very critical. The electricity grid needs to be decarbonized because a lot of future technologies are going to be dependent on having an electricity supply which is a low emissions electricity supply. For example, electric vehicles. And therefore, the Philippine Energy Plan, as an example, already aims to, in its most optimistic scenario, aims to source most of our electricity from renewables by 2050. Still, more progress is going to be needed. We're going to need to aim beyond 2050 and eventually target practically eliminating fossil fuels by the second half of the century. And of course, this is a point that we've been trying to make. My colleagues and I have been arguing that even though a net zero commitment seems to be such a daunting pledge, what the Philippines needs is a top-down declaration that maybe cuts across multiple generations, because that provides a roadmap for various policies that will implement the steps towards that eventual net zero goal. It's not going to be done overnight, but the ambition needs to be there. What it means for Philippine companies is, just imagine that if the nature of your business requires you to operate across national boundaries, say you're an airline or shipping company, or if a large part of your sales are based on exports. Regardless of what happens within the Philippines, your company operations are going to need to account for the net zero targets and climate change regulations that are occurring in those target markets. Otherwise, potentially, the markets for Philippine companies that fail to embrace this challenge will be shrinking in the future, and therefore the prospects for economic growth will be threatened as well. So having an awareness of net zero and climate change mitigation is not simply a matter of idealism, it's a matter of practical business considerations if you have a long-term view of growth and development for this country. So I'll conclude there, and I thank you all for your attention, and I hope we can discuss further this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. And that was a very eye-opening presentation. I hope more people will listen to this. I just want to ask one question, maybe. How important, knowing that there are grassroots or down below the without a net zero commitment, how important is that now, and in that we put one now, and how long can we stave off not doing a net zero commitment in terms of the industries?
Well, it's a matter of making Philippine companies and therefore the Philippine economy much more competitive. What happens basically is in industries that are well organized, for example, the aviation industry, then if there's no guidance, top-down guidance from the Philippine government, then the efforts by, say, Philippine Airlines, for example, or Cebu Pacific would be guided but by how they benchmark with other airline companies in the world. Because you're going to have to keep, it's either you get left behind or you keep up with the rest of them. So that simply means that they're going to have to fend for themselves, as it were, to keep up with the technological trends and what are the best, for example, technologies and pollution abatement measures they should invest in. Should they refleet their planes, and the same goes for factories here. If they're exporting, for example, food products or electronic products to other countries, eventually those customers are going to demand carbon footprint declarations from Philippine companies, and they may eventually select different suppliers if they find the carbon footprint to be unsatisfactory. So what is essential is that because the carbon footprint reduction requires technological investments, it's important that, shall we say, it's better if these decisions can be made early in anticipation of those trends, rather than rushing to a decision just because you're facing a crisis. And this is, I think it's the role of the government to provide, as in the case of more developed countries, fiscal incentives for green technology so that companies can invest early and therefore not just be trying to catch up all the time. Could be market leaders in their respective business areas. So I think that's why it's important.
It's really important we do it now and do it early. Otherwise, we might even have a disparity among all the other suppliers.
Correct, yes.
Right. Okay, we'll continue our discussion with this topic more in a while. Let's now just quickly call on our next speaker. So he is unable to join us today. He is the director and founder of Stratbase Group of companies. Professor Manhit is actually part of a think tank that looks into the variations in industry trends and brings out policy and recommendation for what the industry will need. So let him make his own introduction as well, and let's listen to Dr. Manhit's talk.
And thank you, the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. I thank you for organizing this important discussion. I'm quite honored to share some insights and recommendations on our nation's shift towards a green, sustainable development. At Stratbase, we monitor climate risk as part of our broader geopolitical risk assessment. And one of our key focus areas is the impact of extreme weather and natural disasters on national stability and growth. These hazards hinder our economy, disrupt communities, and threaten ecosystems. Dr. Tan's paper presents a stark reality. The Philippines remains without a net zero pledge, even as our emissions intensity increases, putting us out of sync with global decarbonization efforts. We are navigating a world that has been called hot, flat, and crowded, where climate change accelerates, global competition intensifies, and finite resources are under strain. In such a world, relying on carbon-heavy system is not only unsustainable, it is economically short-sighted. We continue to face the challenge of extreme weather events, natural disasters, and the impacts of the climate crisis. Now, more than ever, there's a need for strategic climate action and initiatives for decarbonization and for promoting the circular economy. In 2024, we experienced the warmest year on record, marked by extreme weather, rising seas, and record emissions. The Philippines has been especially hard hit. We rank as the most climate vulnerable country in the World Risk Index, and for 3 years straight, and the 10th country most affected by extreme weather over the past 30 years. Up until 2022, a climate risk index report revealed that we have endured 372 disasters, costing us $34 billion in losses. This reality reflects the need for coordinated and strategic climate action to take place. Effective climate action requires strategic collaboration with all sectors of Philippine society. These actions should be anchored in transparent and accountable governance. Through our environmental program in Stratbase, the Philippine Business for Environment Sustainability, we advocate 3 core strategies the Philippines must pursue to drive greater sustainability. We are our own environment stakeholders. First, we must decarbonize the grid by accelerating the shift to clean energy and ensuring the responsible mining of critical minerals essential to this transition. Second, we need to electrify transportation by promoting the adoption of electric vehicles, especially in public transport, investing in infrastructure to support this shift. Third, we must develop the Philippines' critical mineral industry, positioning our country as a key player in the global transition to clean energy. With abundant resources like nickel and cobalt, we have the potential to lead the clean energy value chain, provided we integrate sustainability, renewables, and circular economy practices into our mining operations. I would argue, and I have argued in the past, the Philippines cannot afford to fall behind. The cost of inaction is rising, not just in terms of climate change, but in lost opportunities. So let us commit to a just and science-driven transition, anchored in climate ambition and economic resilience. Again, thank you for this opportunity to talk about our views on why the Philippines must commit a clean energy future.
Thank you, Dr. Manhit. It was just sad that you were unable to come and join us today because he had previous commitments. He was the one who gave a talk on energy and environment at the recently concluded 2025's Marine Security Discussion in the region. So our next speaker is also not going to be telling us about the new innovations and his discoveries in the area of conservation. So who we have today now is Dr. Neil Aldrin Mallari. He's the regional focal point of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, a National Geographic Explorer, and an Ashoka Fellow on Biodiversity Conservation practitioner and advocate. He's the founder, co-founder, and a number of biodiversity conservation NGOs in the Philippines, including Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines and the Center for Conservation Innovation in the Philippines, where he is the president. As a seasoned conservationist, he has led programs, development, and directed various projects in the Philippines designed to implement and promote biodiversity conservation, improve protected area management, habitat restoration, strategic planning, and organization development. He has extensive experience in working with government agencies, funding agencies, development partners, and the investment portfolio for biodiversity conservation. Aldrin completed his undergrad from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, his PhD from Manchester Metropolitan University, UK. He has more than 40 scientific publications under his belt, including 2 award-winning and semi-conservation books, Threatened Birds of the Philippines, and Key Conservation Sites in the Philippines. Aldrin is currently an ecology professor in Salle University and Far Eastern University in the Philippines, where he focuses on strengthening conservation science and conservation capabilities for future conservation leaders to improve practices. So let us now welcome Dr. Neil Aldrin Mallari.
Thank you, Doc Menchie. I'll if I can share my slides, if that's possible. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, Doc.
Okay. I'll share my slides if that's possible. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, Doc.
Okay, sorry for that dead air. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Tan and Dr. Manhit, for initiating the discourse. I was listening intently and reflecting on your paper and your presentation. And now I'm reflecting based on using my biodiversity ecosystem service and natural capital sort of lens. I did notice that looking at the NDC, notice that the forestry is not seen as a vital contributor to emissions reduction. As you can see here, it's a bit woolly. In fact, if we look at the commitment, targets, and costs in our NDC, we feel that absence. Why? Were we not able to consistently account for the ERRs or reductions and removals? Is it just a methodological issue, or is it a capacity issue, or maybe a technological issue? At the moment, we don't know. The data just isn't there. Meanwhile, looking at the Philippines' climate change strategies, it is clear that the bias is towards adaptation. Look at the budget here. The budget of mitigation is far more than what we have for mitigation. But if you look at the carbon flux analysis of the Global Forest Watch, here it outlines the levels of emissions from forestry in the past 4 years. Whilst the cumulative emissions of over 900 million metric tons in the past 2 decades seem to not figure in our NDC, unfortunately. The Global Forest Watch, in its deep dive, show the main drivers of the attrition or deforestation, forest degradation, and showing the main drivers as conversion of either permanent agriculture or shifting agriculture, obviously tied to food production. And when that's translated to CO2 emissions, you can see clearly there that nature-based emissions are quite large. And even the IPCC is cognizant of the value of forest and forestry sector in climate change mitigation. We see this graph here. So the Philippines shows evidence to support this. In fact, the Global Forest Watch is claiming that the Philippines is a net carbon sink in the past 4 years. The net, if you look at the global analysis, again, the net tropical deforestation produces 8% of the net emissions. But halting and reversing the tropical deforestation could reduce total emissions by up to 30%. If you look at this graph. So it's a combination of avoidance of emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, and planting of trees and allowing forests to regrow. Up to 30%. And imagine if the avoidance and removals are eligible for forest carbon projects, this investable carbon may provide an alternative financing stream to underwrite the cost of mitigation and conservation. This is based on 2 papers published in 2021. But of course, this is not a silver bullet. The carbon released immediately from deforestation can take a century to reestablish through forest regrowth. In the climate change mitigation space, many entities, mostly corporates and government, prefer tree planting, reforestation, afforestation, or revegetation than avoiding emissions from deforestation or forest degradation. To us, avoiding the loss of irreplaceable carbon or carbon that is tied to irreplaceable biodiversity and ecosystem service should take primacy. Deforestation and climate change drive a vicious cycle that exacerbates poverty. As a nature and biodiversity conservation worker, this is the crux of our work, addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystem service degradation. There is a syndromic dynamic between deforestation and climate change, and ultimately affect biodiversity and us, people. Let's see some case studies. This is a study that we did in 2023 in Palawan, the Mount Mantilingan protected landscape. It is showing significant land change conversion or land conversion, land cover change of this protected area in Palawan. 37% loss in open forest and 9% loss in closed forest and so on, as you can see in this map, giving us a net loss of around about 12,000 hectares of forest. And as a result, there was a corresponding and significant contraction of suitable habitats linked with the reduction of both extent and quality of forest cover, coupled with the records of direct persecution of wildlife via hunting and bushmeat. So as you can see in this map, there's a contraction of key habitats for biodiversity in this protected area. And when you convert that to carbon stocks, there it is showing a downhill or downward trend in the carbon stocks, with emissions outweighing carbon removals. As you can see, the opening balance and the closing balance between the different cover types: bonsai forest, closed forest, mangrove forest, and open forest. Aside from anthropogenic drivers of change, we are facing the deleterious effects of climate change. Because of climate change, severe weather events have or are predicted to increase, both in frequency and intensity. Last December 2021, we have seen Typhoon Odette or Super Typhoon Rai ravage the country. And here we see the path of that typhoon. And the impacts are staggering. For example, in the case of Palawan, the extent and magnitude of the damage is severe. Imagine 57% of the forest in this landscape destroyed by the typhoon. And let's talk about loss and damage for a bit and link that with emissions. The massive land cover change is equivalent to the emissions of well over 118 million metric tons, and all in one day. This is 3 to 4 times more than what we would have been or Palawan would have emitted in the last by 2050 if business as usual. I was told that this emission is equivalent to a coal-fired power plant operating in 10 years. And this happened in just one day from deforestation. This is the island endemic Palawan hornbill. This is a great sea disperser and an excellent indicator of forest health. Long-term survival of the species is massively compromised, as these surviving individuals would have been isolated from the rest of the island. If you can see notice the inset map there. What you see is flashing is the area of habitat that was reduced and contracted and fragmented because of Typhoon Odette. If the species goes down the tube, there's very slim chance for the forest of Palawan to regenerate naturally. Let's zoom in for a bit in one of the protected areas in the landscape affected by Odette. This is the underground river, Puerto Princesa Subterranean River National Park. Many of you would have visited the underground river by now, hopefully. And you would notice the area shaded in gray. These are attributed to forest loss due to typhoon. It's about there. 96% of the open forest lost. There's a 48% damage in closed forest, 73% damage in dense mangrove, 100% damage in plantations. It's so heartbreaking, I suppose, having worked there for the last 25 years. If we convert this damage, this attrition in forests to GHG emissions, and convert that to using monetary value using the social cost of carbon, we're looking at a carbon stock value of 46 billion pesos before Odette. But after Odette, we've seen an attrition loss, a net emission value of 10 billion pesos. And so, obviously there's the total stock, the carbon stock was reduced between the opening and closing periods. Forest ecosystems in the Puerto Princesa Subterranean River National Park are important sources of livelihood, as demonstrated by the estimation of the contribution of forests to almasiga resin or bagtik. Suitable habitats of the almasiga tree show that there's a significant decline in the total of harvest for that year. Just like the case of many protected areas, rent estimates leave us much to be desired, though. Due to the low farm gate prices of resin relative to other areas in Palawan, 2.7 million pesos is significant, especially for a decline of 2.7 million pesos is significant to our brothers from the indigenous peoples communities. Last year, we had about 6 major typhoons happening in rapid succession, one after the other, ravaging the northern and southern part of the country. But like many post-typhoon assessments of the focus of the assessments and response, rehabilitation and reconstruction is clearly focused on infrastructure and public utilities. Except for assessing damage to crops and perhaps water bodies, there's hardly any mention of the extent of damage to ecosystems. Ecosystem restoration efforts, if at all considered at the outset of the recovery planning and recovery planning process, or in other words, adaptation, tend to be short-term, unsustainable, and lack solid scientific support. These issues can severely limit nature's ability to act as a natural barrier against the physical impacts of disaster. It also diminishes the nature's capacity to provide essential services such as food, water, shelter, and livelihood opportunities, thereby increasing social vulnerabilities. Women with lower socioeconomic status, limited access to opportunities, and increased exposure to risks are particularly at risk. When health and resilience of ecosystems decline, so do the resilience and recovery capacities of the people. Many of us in this room know too well the impacts of extreme weather events, especially outside of the urban areas. Like Odette, to sources of community livelihoods such as rattan, almasiga resin, and honey. But often, what remains invisible in post-disaster assessment and planning are the impacts of forest-dependent communities and indigenous peoples. I hope that their plight becomes less invisible and voices heard. Our resilience lies heavily on our natural capital. Let's invest more on mitigation and nature-positive actions. Let's create a safe operating space for biodiversity, people, and nature. Because, as we say, we can never be okay if nature is not okay. Salamat, magandang umaga.
Thank you very much, Doc Aldrin. That was an interesting discussion and a very holistic one about forestry as a whole. But what really strikes me is that nature services, particularly in greenhouse gas emissions eventually of forests, are not necessarily quantified and not included in the short-sighted, unsustainable efforts to actually create adaptation measures. It is basically a very quickly tied process. Dr. Tan, do you have any comments on what Sir Aldrin just presented?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Actually, you touched on a very important point that there is going to be a very large market for carbon removal credits or CDR credits in the future. McKinsey projects the CDR market to reach the $1 trillion level by 2050. And part of that will, of course, be natural climate solutions based on either terrestrial or marine carbon management. Certainly something that we should look at as a win-win solution for the future.
You might want to tell us more, Dr. Aldrin, of the Sukat ng Kalikasan effort that you're creating. Because if we see ecosystem services as a supply and our use of carbon as a demand, how are we doing in terms of moving forward? And it can actually be a very good argument towards the net zero policy that we might want to focus on, tying in the adaptation and mitigation aspects of it.
Thanks. When we talk to private sector, often we forget that all of our businesses are nature-based. Even BPOs. In the recent analysis that came out, saying that every Google search would maybe consume about 3 grams of carbon. And so it all adds up. We tend to work in silos businesses work on businesses, and so think about emissions and emissions reductions from industry, from electricity, and so on. But where do you get these resources? All of these come from nature. Your water that generate the electricity, the sun, and minerals for that matter. So I think the intersectionality of nature, natural capital, should be in the discourse and in the materiality computation, and that this shouldn't be just CSR. That the core business of business perhaps is ensuring that, as we said, there's a safe operating space for biodiversity and people. Otherwise, if nature is not okay and we continue that downhill trend, it will be risky for any business to have your wind farms in slopes that will eventually become eroded because you destroy forests, or even geothermal power plants. Without forests, and without forests, you don't have that sponge that sucks in the water and draws that water into the fissures, creating those steam. So that intersects. I'd like to say that I'd like to quote Secretary Luisaga whenever we have that conversation. She will always say, "We need to measure what we treasure." And so if we treasure nature, we need to measure it. And by that, it means that when we just count emissions from either industrial or land use or land cover change, without making those connections, I think we're missing the point. And so resilience, perhaps, as a way forward, should be nature-based. And last bit I'd like to say is that even economists from Cambridge were saying, Professor Dasgupta, that economy is embedded in ecology, and therefore there shouldn't be a dichotomy between economy and ecology, or ecosystems and ecosystem surveys. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. And the dichotomy for me has basically been collapsed in this discussion. We're waiting for Gerry Alava, but Ms. Fevi hasn't logged in yet, right? So in the meantime, may we start talking about answering some of the questions. So Dr. Tan and other speaker, Dr. Mallari, to what extent can the transition to electric vehicles reduce carbon emissions, considering that the production of EVs and their components, that is batteries, electronic systems, as well as electricity used for charging, still largely relies on non-renewables or carbon-intensive energy sources?
Yeah, that's certainly a good point to make. It's not just electric vehicles, by the way. There are significant research efforts being put towards electrifying many factories, industrial facilities, replacing, for example, oil or gas-fired boilers with electric boilers. And all of that is predicated on having a clean supply of electricity. Certainly, you're going to not maximize the benefits if you're going to just build new coal-fired power plants to meet the incremental demand of electric vehicles or factories. There will still be some gains in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that's going to be very small compared to what would happen if you're building, say, wind farms or solar farms to meet the incremental demand. The key word here is incremental. It's not, in other words, the electricity already being generated now by existing plants is already spoken for. And therefore, if you add extra demand because there are more electric vehicles, then you build new power plants for that. The question is, what are the new power plants going to be like? Preferably renewables, or if it's going to be a mix, then we need the mix to be much cleaner. An extra point I want to make, statistically, it's actually unfortunate that over the past 20 years, the average carbon intensity of electricity in the Philippines has gone up roughly from about 0.5 to 0.6 kilograms per kilowatt hour. So it's gone up by about 20% in 2 decades. It seems like a small number, but if you think of what's happening to the rest of the world, in that same period, the average for the world went down. So we're actually tracking in the opposite direction. Thanks for that
Right.
question.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll just proceed with that, Dr. Tan, because it's still on EVs. And then I will come back to you, Dr. Mallari, and ask you about your experience working with the private sector on the green energy. So how might the high upfront cost of EVs impact their affordability and accessibility for most individuals and businesses? And Dr. Tan, what measures can the Philippine government implement to encourage widespread adoption of EVs and help offset the initial costs burden of consumers and businesses?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. I think we can rely on one thing. And we know this because cell phones used to be a luxury when they first came out. I remember when I was a young man, when we were much younger, say back in the 1990s, cell phones were luxury items. Now many people have 2 phones at any given time. It becomes something that you can't live without. So in general, for technology, there's an initial high cost, but there's a phenomenon known as technology learning, in which as more and more people buy these new technologies or devices, they get cheaper. And this is going to happen to electric cars. So it's a question of when you jump in, whether you're an individual or a company. At some point, you can sort of strategize on when to replace your current vehicles and buy the new ones based on a projection of how much cheaper they'll get, say, between now and 2030 or between now and 2035. But you can count on it that as sure as death and taxes, the prices will go down. I think we already have plenty of incentives in place. For example, just consider for private motorists, the prospect of being exempted from color or number coding in the streets of Metro Manila. That is a very strong incentive for spending a bit of extra money on an electric car rather than having to buy 2 vehicles to navigate the coding scheme. So that's an example of an incentive which I think works very well.
And I think I've
Thank you
seen
for that.
also incentives from the private sector, where I've seen a billboard that says buy one hybrid, get a free electric. So it's like cars now become buy one thing. So Dr.
wow.
Mallari, I would go back to you because Dr. Emma Porio also has a question here eventually. How, in your experience, before we ask Dr. Porio's question, how has private sector been accepting? How have they been allowing you to be involved in their strategies for the development of decarbonization? Because you did say that's easier to just plant trees than actually reduce their own carbon. So
Yeah,
and what is your perspective about that?
I suppose in this woke era, many companies generally want to contribute to climate change mitigation. Yeah, but I see sort of a range. The easy bit, just plant trees, commit to 1 or 2 or several hectares, plant trees, because it's easy to measure, hectares, number of seedlings, fine. And, to, an extreme, not really extreme, to the other far end of that spectrum, where they look at, action beyond compliance, because and any private sector or business would have to secure an ECC and so on. So part of their mitigation plan is that decarbonization and so on. But I think the missing link there is the weakness in government policies to guide businesses. Because when, for example, I've been speaking with the Chamber of Mines, and talking, can we reduce the emissions from your operations and reduce the impacts on biodiversity? They said, yeah, we'll follow your sukat ng kalikasan, but at the moment there's no regulation, and it's not part of of the compliance mechanism or standards. So we have to do a root canal, for example, of the EIA system so that we can effect that change. And the other is about the perspective of quick fixes. That planting trees would immediately sequester the carbon. It is a long game. Many corporations and government easily become very, very tired and bored. After 4 years, the plants or the seedlings have just grown to about 4 meters. And by that time, it's not even considered a tree, and so, less than 30 centimeters girth. It's not even a tree. It's still a sapling, if you like. And so it doesn't, it sucks in, it traps CO2. But for you to regain the emission of, say, deforestation or from deforestation or fires, it would take you about 30, 40, 100 years, in fact, to regain that. So many of us and private sector and government would only have a project implementation phase of about 1 year, 18 months. For a government, maybe 4 years, 6 years. And so it's so temporal. So maybe that's the challenge that we need to face. But private sector is open. So the challenge perhaps is not just private sector doing the right things for the right reason, but also doing it right. That you don't just plant trees as a knee-jerk reaction, or plant because you need to have that hectarage. You plant mangroves in seagrass beds, or revegetate an area with purely bamboo, because at the end of the day, that if that was originally forest and you replace that with bamboo, then you increase the carbon sequestration, but you do not increase the resilience of that ecosystem and diversity that was lost. Does that make sense? So it's that trade-off, I think, is what I'm.
Thank you, Dr. Mallari. I guess I will touch on a question on the circular economy, which both of you are actually experts in. And firstly, for Dr. Tan, technology innovations and the current outlook for their adoption towards the circular economy in the Philippines. How much do you think can these innovations be maximized, or how can they be promoted to be able to tie in to this issue of net zero production or carbon production in the Philippines? What do you think is needed to be able to push that through?
Let me just point out one thing. Although there is a correlation between circular economy and decarbonization, it's not a perfect correlation. And the ultimate decision point here is whether the circular or the recycle reuse pathway has a lower carbon footprint than the original pathway that it's trying to replace. And this is where, of course, there's plenty of engineering that goes into figuring out which pathway is better. That means that for an industrial product, which is very difficult to recycle and which is very energy intensive to recycle for whatever reason, potentially maximizing that recycling could have carbon emissions penalties for some products. On the other hand, for other products, then the solution is actually very simple. So in the case of aluminum, for instance, the production of aluminum from bauxite, primary aluminum, as it's called, is very energy intensive. But by comparison, the recycling of post-consumer aluminum, simply collecting the waste and remelting it, is much less energy intensive than the first pathway. So in the case of that product, creating a circular loop actually creates a win-win solution. You're reducing resource consumption and similarly reducing the carbon footprint of the system. But it doesn't apply uniformly across the board. Final point is, because we've been talking about electrification of transportation, the wars of the future will be fought over minerals instead of petroleum. This is a fact that you can count on. And therefore, even as we know that the electrification is an important decarbonization technology, the capability to recycle all of the components that go into batteries and the electrical vehicles, so that you lessen the dependence on primary resources from mines. That's going to be essential. So here's a case where, for not really for physical reasons, but more for system level reasons, the circular economy principles, when applied to this, will enable deeper cuts in carbon emissions. Thank you for that question.
So definitely it is not equal across all materials when you're talking about recycling, and that the costs will still be the bottom line. Dr. Mallari, there is a question here as well. How can the green economy innovations this time intertwine and then close the loop with circular economy innovations to maximize all our policy and programs? This is from Dr.
I think anything that we do in this life is all about displacement. Yeah, if you do this one thing, it would have a butterfly effect on other places and other resources. So perhaps going back to my point about doing the right things for the right reason, many companies would venture into renewable energies. Yeah. But remember, for example, for wind and geothermal, you would need forests for you to have maximum yield. And this would, for wind, for example, this would have to be positioned in ridges, etc. And incidentally, these are the areas where you have the remaining forests. And so that trade-off of creating those renewable resources, renewable energy sources, and ensuring that your footprint would have net negative impact on your ecosystem is quite key. And if you want to create solar farms, it's the same. Nature would be displaced. The challenge is how do we measure the impacts on nature, and it's essentially what I'm driving at is the system of EIAs and ERA that we have are so weak that it's and antiquated that we're not taking into account ecosystem services that will be compromised by the the footprint. We always count per measure based on our sector. If it will be energy by kilowatt hour or kilowatts, etc., megawatts. But the resources, shared resources, bundled benefits of biodiversity, maybe water, climate change regulation, performed by nature. It's not accounted for in the materiality computation and in the risk and exposure computation and analysis of setting up the business. So it's sort of a long-winded answer to the question, but I think it's all about safeguards. It's all about environmental safeguards. The metrics and the yardsticks for environmental safeguards are quite clear and clear-cut. If you have you exceed parts per million of a certain element or substance, it's a go or no go. But for biodiversity, it's hardly any. It's just a list of species. And so, as we say, if there are no elephants, tigers, or Philippine eagles, you can blast it to bits. But a lot of communities depend on those, the connectivity of nature and connectivity of those ecosystem services. Thank you.
Again, for both of you, what is hindering, I'm just putting the questions together, what is hindering the Philippines from making that net zero commitment? And if you had the chance to mention about all these intersectionality, which doesn't seem to be appreciated, what do you think is the urgent talking point between, let's say, DOST and PNR? Or put it another way, as Dr. Poryo says, what areas of concerns or priority should be put up in front of the DOST and the DNR, whether as a form of regulatory efficiency measure, as mentioned earlier, or even technology? I know it's a big ask to answer right now, and it's rather a Miss Universe question, but what is
Yeah.
stopping us from doing that AI net zero commitment? And if we were to be put in front of people like this, particularly DOST and DNR, what areas of priority would we like them to actually address?
Well, can I give this a shot? Let me try to answer that.
Sure.
I think it's primarily a matter of inertia, psychological inertia, that we've all gotten used to thinking of climate change in terms of adaptation, that we've lost sight of the bigger picture, which is cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And it's partly because of the mentality that it is true that the Philippines is not accountable for any significant historical emissions. I would just pivot the discussion to this, and it's a very practical one, that the livelihoods and jobs of future generations Filipinos will depend on a Philippine economy that's ready for a carbon-constrained world. Now, if you'll allow me an extra couple of minutes, let me point out one example.
Sure. We have time.
The maritime industry is a very good example. Here are a few facts. First of all, the International Maritime Organization has a comprehensive decarbonization roadmap for all of its member companies, leading to net zero, but with what they call checkpoints or intermediate targets every few years. A year ago, the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology held a forum about this, about the readiness of the Philippine maritime sector for net zero. And a lot of the questions I heard during the forum were along the lines of, can Philippine companies afford the technologies that will be needed to achieve net zero? I will be the devil's advocate and pose the opposite question. Can Philippine shipping companies afford not to invest in technologies that will allow them to achieve net zero? Here are a few more facts. 2050 is 25 years away. The average ship in Philippine fleets is something like 20, 25 years old. That means that a ship that is purchased today by a shipping company will still be operating by 2050. And finally, if a company decides that it can't afford to prepare for the future, that suggests that a ship it buys today will be obsolete and unable to enter important destinations by 2050. And the final chain in this, the final link in this chain of events is, if a company doesn't prepare for that future, what's it going to do? Number one, it's not going to grow for sure. It may shrink as a company, eventually downsizing, and therefore downsizing simply means you let go of your employees, you let go of opportunities for your supply chain, and that contributes to the shrinkage of the Philippine economy. So that is my argument. It's a matter of survival and keeping up.
Dr. Mallari, again, on your end for that question, what do you think is the intersectionality issues, and what's stopping us from doing net zero, and what will you tell our government should be the priority?
Thank you for that wonderful question. I believe, pang Miss Universe talaga, I'd like to underscore what Dr. Raymond said. I mean, to me, it's inertia also, and momentum then inertia, or the other way around. To me, I put my bet on the newly approved Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting system or law. Because if we are able to push for that, I think we're able to measure, count what we treasure and measure what we treasure, sort of thing, so that we can be cognizant of the trade-offs that we will need to embrace if we go into that low carbon development pathway. Because let's be honest, if you don't do this, if you do this, you'll have, it's a displacement thing. And therefore, if we know the full extent of your natural capital and how much that will be affected or compromised by a certain decision, be it, electrification and so on, we know how to mitigate, and we know how to, lessen the impacts. As I said, we've been working with an energy company planning to put up a wind farm. So great, that's renewable energy. But when you look at the requirement for the footprint, it's smack in the middle of your remaining lowland forest. So what are the decision points for this? And shifting to a less sort of, how do you say that, minimizing the impact and looking at biodiversity offsets might be quite expensive. For example, rerouting your roads, or what they call that, shifting the position of your turbine would cost. But now in our discussion, they're saying, probably it will be more expensive to do that, but in the long run, the new position would be less, it will be in areas that will be less flood prone or less erosion prone areas, and therefore it will be more, it will make more business sense, because it's increasing the resilience of the business too. So finding that shared value between ecosystem service, and the business that they have, I think is key with government. And government units should start talking to ourselves. The Tower of Babel should be torn down, because many in government, our decision making is so desynchronous that kanya-kanya lang talaga na it's not doing that intersectionality. Thank you.
Definitely. And I just want to share one screen right now. So this is something I got from the Goodyear, and it shows a very, very interesting presentation of how supply side versus demand side, we can look at ecosystem services versus ecosystem services demand. And the very tight lines across it will then be the crosstalk that has been occurred. So I see that at the end of the day, it's really a matter of what you're able to quantify in terms of the future and how much each of these will cost. And that is the crosstalk between agencies that needs to be done. So what I'm getting from your discussion is, I don't know if I'm right, it's not a matter of availability of money, but that the thing should be a creation of a well thought of plan that can then merge both your worlds, Dr. Tan's world and Dr. Mallari's, into coming up with decisions in particular areas. So maybe that could be something that can be put forward in the discussion with the government and the applications.
It should go beyond the CSR. That doing that means, security of the business, and, as they say in the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit. Well, we say you cannot have profit if you don't have people and planet. So having that as a mantra perhaps will help guide the decision making.
In your experience, Dr. Tan, Dr. Mallari, how willing is the private sector? Is it dependent on how big they are, or how much money, or what kind of industry they're in? Because I know that the difficulty in the government now will be crosstalk and integration. But at the end of the day, when we do have, let's just imagine a very well thought of plan, how well do you think will the private sector at this time be willing to actually comply, if not be supportive of such a measure? Dr. Tan.
In my experience, companies which are exposed to international competition, or those whose business are naturally international in nature, are very willing, and in fact are looking for solutions to be able to adjust to the global energy transition. Companies which operate purely domestically are probably not as aware because there are no government signals. The risk for these companies, or the business risk, I mean, is just potentially they might be missing out on growth opportunities. So say you're making processed food products mainly for a Philippine market. Maybe you're going to be unable to expand into a major exporter if you don't have proper carbon management practices, if you don't have that knowledge.
Dr. Mallari, in your experience working with companies, you did say they in general are willing.
Yeah, I mean, there are small companies that because the leadership believe in, their responsibility in healing the earth or healing nature, they, those activities and programs are part of their core business. From, shifting from using the packaging to selling, refilling stations for soap and oil, etc. Those are simple things, but because they're driven by the owners' genuine intention to do the right things for the right reason and doing it right, I think they're partaking of that. I don't know about the the medium term, medium size businesses where it's a sink or swim type of thing. It's an investment to do to join to go to a low emissions pathway. For example, small supermarkets or grocery stores, they would go to, they can't comply with, non-plastic or just paper. But I have a student that looks at the source of this packaging, brown bag, and preliminary results showing that even for large supermarkets, the 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 bags, the brown bags, are in fact sourced from raw materials not recycled, and therefore, when you do the cost benefit analysis, it might be more environment friendlier to use plastic, bags if you recycle them than straight up impose use of paper bags. And so, doing the right things for the right reason and doing it right, and not joining the bandwagon, I think is key. And many companies would like to do that because of the social pressures, and now because if you're an SEC and public company, then you're exposed to public pressure that you need to show evidence that you're going to the low emissions pathway. Otherwise, you'll be branded as a non-green company, and so that social pressure system is there. But for the most part, the intention is good, but you have to invest. It has to hurt, and it will hurt because the alternatives and alternative pathways would need that inertia and momentum to keep it going. It needs money.
Right. So inertia, momentum, and so many of the misconceptions, I'd say, for how this process should actually proceed. And that's why we need government to lead us. Okay, I have a question here from Dr. Benigno Paxson. Is the Philippines working with other countries in mitigating the effects of climate change? I really note this particularly because of the Climate Change Commission's presentation last week, they were basically talking about the budgets that were going into adaptation versus mitigation, and now I don't see the line anymore. But when we talk about mitigation budgets of like over a fifth of what's going into adaptation, and the reason behind that is being the issue that climate action is supposed to be climate justice, and that as provisions of the Paris Agreement, there is like a responsibility of those who are basically emitters to help those that are non-emitters to address their issues in technology and all of that. How do you think, now that the line seems very blurry to me at the moment, is the Philippines working with other countries in mitigating the effects of climate change? And how should we basically partition our efforts in this area, even budgets?
I think we're not capitalizing on opportunities. Let me just paint a simple picture here, hypothetical but very plausible. Decarbonization ultimately will happen in the private sector. Emissions come from factories, from products, and therefore the technology changes that are needed to eliminate or reduce those emissions will take place in the private sector. The role of government is as an enabler. And one of the things that could happen, for example, would be fiscal measures. Companies, whether big or small, might need resources to invest in technologies that will allow them to clean up their operations. What if, for example, say the Development Bank of the Philippines, for instance, what if they had a soft loan facility to make it easier for companies to invest in green technologies? They could actually potentially be the go-between and take advantage of climate finance opportunities, so that those opportunities, which are initially at the national level, become accessible to companies in the Philippines, so that it actually becomes eventually a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that can actually be done, because it's actually been done for other environmental issues in the past. Doing it for climate should be relatively straightforward, especially because pledges from developed countries rather, to support decarbonization are growing in volume. So it's simply a matter of the Philippines getting its act together, understanding that mitigation is, from the global standpoint, actually a bigger part of the picture. And if you capitalize on those opportunities, then you have both environmental and economic gains for Philippine companies and Philippine citizens in the future.
What you're basically saying is that we can use our own resources to leverage this larger opportunities and create like the Poso effect. You put water and then more water will go out. It's just a matter of figuring out, one, our commitment, just to be part of the discussion.
Yep.
And then secondly, into finding out those clear-cut programs that can then be put forward for that kind of research. Dr. Mallari, what's your take on this? How is the Philippines working with other countries in mitigating the effects of climate change, innovation in some other area? What do you see?
Maybe I'll answer that this way. I think it's a matter of mindset. The fact that we are investing more on adaptation, it sends a signal that the saying that kawawa naman tayo, we need to be, we're battered every time, and so our investment would be, build back better, create economy, and worry about mitigation less than adaptation. But more and more, the more we work with communities, it's not just working across the board, across the globe, but also across sectors and across communities within the Philippines. Is those silos is, I think, preventing us from realizing our goals of mitigation or objectives of mitigation. I mean, that opportunity of forest carbon financing is there since 2010, and the only red project that we have is what we are having with Ayala Corporation, and that's the only and first and only red project, reduction of emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. That is about to cross the Rubicon at internationally verified by Vera. So we're looking at a magnitude of about 3 or so million metric tons of verified carbon units that are tradable in hopefully within the year. There are a lot of opportunities for that, but there's a very slow uptake. International companies would want to buy offset credits, and maybe the government in the Philippines, as a nation, should start thinking about generating those offset credits to sell. And because if you do that, it is beneficial to ecosystems, and therefore generates that alternative financing stream to make us more resilient or eco-resilient in future. So that I think of those two things, I think would need are low-hanging fruits, but we tend not to partake of it.
Right. Thank you very much. And we have to close in a while, but maybe this last question coming from our president, Dr. Gladys Completo. While plastics are often discussed in terms of pollution, especially ocean waste, their role in climate change tends to receive less attention. Would you comment to the full carbon footprint of plastics across their life cycle, from fossil fuel extraction to manufacturing, transportation, and eventually disposal or degradation, and how significant that impact is in the global context of climate change? So maybe that's our last question. I'll add one more from a student here who says, how does AI figure in on this? Maybe that's always the question of the younger generation, because they are actually very cognizant of the effect of AI. So let's talk first about the plastic and the footprint as discussed by Dr. Gladys. And then please comment shortly about the AI contribution in all this, and then we will close.
The carbon footprint of plastics comes from, first of all, the energy that is used to manufacture the plastics. And that's a chain of processes from extracting the raw materials from the ground all the way to delivering it to the end user. So that's a large part of it. Then the other component potentially depends on how the plastic waste at the end of its life is managed. If it goes into an incinerator, of course, the carbon that is in the polymer goes into the atmosphere. So the carbon footprint is much bigger. So that tells us basically that there are going to be big variations in the carbon footprint depending on how the system is configured. But the cycle, the plastic goes around in cycles or goes into a landfill. But it is possible to reduce the carbon footprint by using alternative feedstocks. So for example, bioplastics are a real thing. You can use feedstocks, alternative feedstocks, to produce viable substitutes like polylactic acid, which can be used for packaging. I'll end this response with one provocative note. There was a Nature paper published, I believe, in 2022 or 2023 by Stegman and co-workers that estimated that under very specific conditions, you could take a plastic supply chain or plastic life cycle, and it can become negative emissions, or it could have a negative carbon footprint if you plan it properly. You can find that with Google, of course, if you're interested. Thanks.
Dr. Mallari, what's your take about the plastic and the focus on plastic in all of these issues? And how do you perceive that as being useful in your greenhouse gas reforestation initiatives?
Well, I think Doc Raymond was quite right that the harmfulness, if you like, is in the production and the disposal of that. But more importantly for us from the biodiversity sector, when you look at the mind share of the general public, um, when we did the survey in 2021, pollution, solid, and pollution in water, plastic pollution has 79% top of mind, spontaneous recall for the general public, but climate change is number 4, and lower still is biodiversity and deforestation, which is about 4% of the mind share. So it's early days, I suppose, making those connections. And what was more interesting or curious in that survey, we did that in the middle of the pandemic, and zoonotic diseases and health issues figured last, guarding only less than 2% of the mind share of public. And so again, if to have that inertia of changing, because there's the plastic issue is very noisy. The issue of decarbonizing is very noisy, because it's easier to um, to measure and easy to grasp, especially in the urban areas. In the rural areas, this doesn't have traction at all. In the rural areas, it's about water, it's about low yield in our farms, and they don't associate it with climate change. It is about the drive of a local executive of saying, let's build a coal-fired power plant in the middle of a key biodiversity area. Those are the decision points that are made on a day-to-day basis. So making those connections, making having that momentum, inertia, and momentum to change the way we do business, change the mindset, I think is key. And so, sorry, it's a long-winded answer. It's a bit off tangent, but I think that is the main driver of that, because of our top of mind, big mind share on large mind share of pollution, that we lose sight of irreplaceable carbon, and the restorative power of nature. And we always have that the messiah complex, that we will save nature, we will save the eagle, we will save that forest. Perhaps the main role that we have as scientists and as thinking people is maybe find solutions that will allow nature to heal itself, because main tenet of ecology is that nature finds that state of homeostasis, but our role perhaps is to keep the threats at bay, so that nature or earth can heal itself, and that lies the problem, I think.
Yeah, so just giving way to one millennial Gen Z question. What's your perception of how AI should figure in all of these? Maybe they want to help. And maybe after that we will end our time.
Okay, I'll keep this short and sweet. AI, like any other technology, is potentially double-edged. We all know that it's energy and carbon intensive. But at the same time, there's the prospect that AI can be used as an important tool to help discover new technologies that can then be used to help the world decarbonize, like discovering new materials for future batteries and such. So that is where I will conclude. Thanks.
For Aldrin.
Well, for us, we're experimenting and pushing the envelope of AI now, to create those decision support systems for natural resource decision makers. Maybe we're now trying to figure out the best combination of prompts to help protected area managers or natural resource managers to say, we will not allow this or guide them on finding out where are the no-go or go zones, or what sort of activities that they need to control to minimize the impact. But as Dr. Raymond said, it's always a double-edged sword. Any brilliant tool, sabi nga nila, if you give a Instamatic camera, those disposable cameras, to a great photographer of National Geographic, I bet you they can produce better photos than us having a sophisticated camera with millions of megapixels, because it is, they're trained to do that, and they have the expertise. And so the challenge perhaps for the society is, how do we transfer that knowledge, and how do we create more scientists, thinkers, and maybe use the technology to help us think faster and make it more efficient, rather than replace decision making that is, I would say, founded on science and conscience.
Right. So thank you so much. I am just very sad that President Gerry was unable to join us today, but we had spent the time in discussions, and it seemed like it turned out well anyway. I would like to thank both Dr. Aldrin Mallari and Dr. Raymond Tan for taking the time to be in this discussion. And now we have this certificate of appreciations that we are passing on to you. By the way, those in the discussion, please look at the evaluation link, and please fill them in so that we can see what you're going to have discussed today. I also want to advertise next PAASE meeting on the 13th will be specifically on this issue of training. How do we put climate change mitigation, adaptation concepts into the training of our next generation? And we have as guests from the universities and the institutions that are partly parties. So we would like to show you these next climate change webinar series, academic and scientific contributions to climate change action, plans and collaborative efforts, particularly from Ms. Sharina Ripolio of UPMSI, Dr. Lico Angkog from CIRCA, Dr. Dixon Cavallo, and Ramon Eusebio, Dr. Ramon Eusebio, both from the NRC. So please join us next meeting. We also have speakers for food, nutrition, health, and education. This is the NAST Fireside Chat series on Pagtanaw 2050. The Pagtanaw 2050 is supposedly a document that will help contribute to the development of science and technology for the future until 2050. And therefore, we will have a series of Pagtanaw discussions. The next one will be with Dr. Rod Azanza, and she'll be talking about the environment. So these documents are really very important to us. Another one will be a fireside chats on water, energy, and AI from former Secretary, Dr. Academician, Dr. Fortunato de la Peña. So these are the series that are up for the PAASE discussions, and you would see that PAASE really wants to contribute to how the government is proceeding in terms of their policy, in terms of opening discussions like this. We have taken a lot today, Dr. Raymond and Dr. Aldrin, from the discussion, and I think we have a lot to discuss as well in the future. So there's a call for abstracts, PAASE annual meeting, PAASE symposium. The deadline of submission is June 1. Ma'am Feb, is this still okay? And this will be a series of the annual PAASE meeting that will be held partly initially in the US, South Carolina, and here for these discussions as well. So please check the PAASE website for this following opportunities. So thank you so much. May I ask if it's okay, all the participants to please open the camera so we can have one picture after we call on Dr. Gladys Completo to close our time together. So Dr. Gladys for her closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you. Wonderful webinar. Congratulations, Carmen, and great discussions. So good morning once again, and thank you to everyone who joined us. So on behalf of the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, or as you all know, PAASE, thank you for being part of this second session of our climate change webinar series. And today's theme, innovation, industry, and the energy sector, advancing climate responsive industries. We brought together a diverse and very insightful panel of speakers whose work challenges us to rethink our ways of doing things. Really, it was just listening to the discussions where it was very inspiring, and hope all of our participants, we learned a lot. I learned a lot from this webinar. So we are especially grateful to our speakers, of course, Dr. Raymond Tan, for sharing insights on sustainable engineering and systems innovation, also emphasizing the need for net zero commitment. And of course, Dr. Dindo Manhit, although just giving a recording, emphasized that as to why the Philippines needs a net zero commitment. And Dr. Neil Aldrin Mallari, nice meeting you. And thank you for grounding us in the ecological and conservation imperatives linked to climate action. Unfortunately, Mr. Gerry Alava wasn't able to share with us, but again, your talks help us see the bigger picture on how innovation policy, business, and conservation must work together if we're serious about addressing climate change. You've shown us that solutions are possible and they can come from different sectors when people are willing to collaborate. So to all our attendees, thank you for your active participation. Again, congratulations, Menchi, for being such an awesome moderator and for really, asking good questions and allowing all the participants to give their questions, and you even explain it better. And then we're really serious. You've shown us that we hope that this session has not provided only knowledge, but also inspiration to drive climate responsive solutions in your respective fields. As you can see, PAASE really is very committed, to give information to not just to scientists, but to everybody. So these webinars are being recorded and being live streamed through our FB page. And you can easily just access it. Ano nga ba pangalan? The Filipino Scientists, PAASE, the Filipino Scientists. So we look forward to seeing you in the final installment of our climate change webinar series on June 13. So until then, let's continue the conversation, build alliances, and act with purpose. So, and may we all remain, especially PAASE, remain as catalysts for positive change. Maraming salamat po, and have a good day. And thank you, everyone.
Right. So very quickly, let's just open our cameras and let's have a group picture, Miss Feb. Just one big picture. Let's just make one picture first with Dr. Gladys, if that's okay. All four of us, one picture. And Mom Emma, are you there? Dr. Ben, are you there also? Dr. Emma and Dr. Ben are very were also instrumental in pushing for this climate change.
And then Edna.
And Ma'am Helen Dayo.
Yeah. Thank you. Ang ganda. Bitin na.
Kaskana, Ma'am Ka, yeah, mga PAASE dyan. Let's come. Sir, is Sir Cabellion here still? Let's take our picture. Then we'll have a bigger picture for it.
Okay, po. One, two, three. Smile. Another one po. 1, 2, 3. Smile. For the big picture po.
Picture, everybody, big picture, please.
Aldrin,
and Ma'am Marge, hello.
Hi, Marge.
Marge. Please take the picture. Ma'am.
1, 2, 3. Smile. Page 2 po. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Page 3. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay na po.
Thank
Right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sir Aldrin.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Raymond and Dr. Mallari.
Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
Happy weekend.
you.
Bye.
to
Happy
everybody.
Happy
Happy
weekend.
holidays.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Raj.
Bye. Very interesting.